on reaching the threshold of part 3 of the star, the reader might be tempted to think that the path of reflection undertaken so far might well be taken as concluded with redemption, as expounded at the end of the part 2. But the redemptive space, formally described within the horizon of revelation, does not substitute the final goal of the new thinking. The real world neither attains to the fullness of meaning, nor does it contain in itself the ultimate truth, so that the path experienced in it cannot but account for a dimension essentially incomplete. If, on one hand, the cognitive dynamics of part 1 and 2 comes to the figure of the star by way of the superimposition of two triangles, on the other, the very figure that comes across to us, the resulting unity, alludes to a supreme and ultimate truth, to a final part of call that forever remains beyond this world and which, as such, stays programmatically unfulfilled and postponed to futurity, where, however, the sense of such incompleteness must needs be understood properly as a need for time, or rather, as a need of eternity. In other words, the figure of the star still has to find its consummate fulfillment and reveal itself in its verity, that is, in its eternity. Certainly, the real cosmos does maintain in itself a tension towards this hypercosmos, an intentionality directed to the ultimate consummation. Divine love poured upon man and the world demands substantiation in the commitment of all generations, and in finding total fulfillment in that utopian eschatological horizon, which Rosenzweig defined as the eternal hypercosmos or the hypercosmos of the truth. For the philosopher, truth is not what is true, but what longs to be confirmed as the truth. It demands the sacrifice of life, the ethical, political, and religious commitment of all generations. It longs to be beseeched, implored, and anticipated in time. The concept of fulfillment thus turns into the cornerstone of the entire part 3 of the star. It is therefore understandable why, in this part, the function of the organon is taken on by the liturgy, being the system of sign, social and collective, particular to religious life, that have the power to anticipate the eternal reality, to transform into today the reality to come. The future fulfillment is represented, that is, led unto the actuality of experience, by means of a system of signs already visible, signs pertinent to the religious community, capable of reflecting this reality ever coming true. The giant leap of this overreaching of the threshold of the ever-new cosmos to the eternal hypercosmos is taken into consideration into the introductive title itself, Über die Möglichkeit das Reich zu erbeten, and, as we shall see, in the motto, in Tyrannos. Erbeten. For Rosenzweig, the problem of truth is evidently the problem of desiring truth. What is at stake is redemption, but, ever more so, is the desire for redemption. Hence, the entire introduction is dedicated to prayer. Therefore, at the beginning of part 3, the word erbeten, inserted in the triadic structure beside and beyond the words erkennen and erleben, denotes a new topography of being and indicates an unprecedented of temporality between the Redeemer and the redeemed, just as it happens under form of religious life. A beyond knowledge, beyond experience, but which, at the same time, necessarily implies them. Prayer implores the kingdom, a reality to come that, although essentially implicated in redemption, is, however, present in the history of the world only to the extent that is prophesied in it. While redemption is indeed already part of the manifest world as much as it is of creation or revelation, the kingdom of God, which comprises the fulfillment of redemption, is a reality to come, or rather, as Rosenzweig himself clarifies, a growing reality, which certainly allows us to better grasp the significance of the becoming unity which, in God's case, must not at all be confused with a is still to become. His being at once revealer, creator, redeemer, makes every instant eternal, so that his eternal being is a reality and eternal becoming in every moment. Man and the world, however, have yet to be becoming unity in the day of the Lord, and lend fulfillment to the coming of the kingdom. But they receive the guarantee of eternity in virtue of their being created. But this common foundation, the creation itself, opens up a disproportion, a non-coinciding between man and the world, which may be removed only with the advent of the kingdom. While man is created for the hypercosmos, the cosmos becomes hypercosmos, awaiting man's action, that is, action of love. The world awaits that human action grow ever more in unity with the work of God. In other words, the guarantee for the world's eternity lies in the actions of man. Upon the threshold of this very dissymmetry between man and the world, thus prayer find is Sitzenleben, which is prayer for the fullness of one's own being, one's own time. The temporality on which human action is founded is made up of distinct effort to love one's fellow man, where every movement toward exteriority is always a new beginning, as such inadequate in creating a continuous sequence, in shaping a history. The world, however, has a history, a life that develops independently of man according to a continuous progression. This temporal disproportion explains why it be impossible for man to call any progress the history of redemption and, as an immediate consequence, call any telos. The redemptive space brings about a true and proper eschatological drama, whose problematic nature is owed to the necessarily uncertain character of the when of redemption, which makes our experience of it in some way an experience that is unreal and of an utopian character. This places us within the space of an eschatology that never takes on the form of teleology, precisely in virtue of the impossibility of knowing the when of the kingdom, since its advent is necessarily beyond time and history, where the question of when loses significance. In consequence, the intentionality that man projects upon the future does not correspond to the progression of the world's life, and man's action, being aimed at nothing, bent upon non-coincident with respect to the worldly order, cannot but proceed casually. However, now, such a non-coincidence makes the attainment of redemption impossible. How then to reconcile within the categories of the new thinking man's being in time with God's being eternal and one? How can the eternity of the kingdom be reconciled with the finite time of individual existence? Or turning the question around, how can finite man quench the desire and the need for having eternity? The unknowability of the telos and of the world's unfolding life, in other words, the finite being in time itself, constitute the orientation that drives man to the fullness of being. In his life, he looks to the infinite, even though this infinite abides ever beyond his comprehension, experience, and action. Inasmuch as he cannot predict the scheme of history, nothing remains unto man except to act according to a modality that he is never going to be able to embrace in its totality, and to trustingly await, without any constriction, the fulfillment of the work of God. In one of his letters, Rosenzweig writes, "Every action must be carried out as if the destiny of eternity depended on it." The very form of this eschatological drama in which man plays a part underpins the absolute freedom and the space of free action. Being defined by the limited horizon that surrounds him, man is unable to grasp the full arc of the world. But, contrary to this epistemological defect, man can, in any case, take recourse to the utopian modality of his action, the one most suited to synchronize the temporality of man and of the world, and to project his desires and aspirations far and wide. This desire for the far away, this longing for distant ends, is what defines prayer. However, this projection of desires opens up a problematic horizon. Undoubtedly, prayer projects us beyond our immediate horizon. But then, if it sees too far and demands the unattainable, it comes to miss its appointment with redemption. The latter does not let itself be taken arbitrarily at any moment in time, nor to be reduced to a simple actualization of desires. Redemption does not allow itself to be ravished by overbearing prayer that demands the unattainable, instead of awaiting with fear and imploring that ever possible that makes up the very statute of redemption. Therefore, now we may better understand how come in the caption of the introduction we find the motto in Tyrannos. Beside the mottos to part 1 and 2 in Philosophos and in Theologos, in Tyrannos bears testimony to the main preoccupation that animates part 3 and all of the star, the risk of a relapse into subjectivism, in the infinite desire to embrace the fullness of history, to constitute oneself overlord of the heavens and of the last things. Prayer proper is certainly an itinerary directed to the last things, but in an incomplete way, a way that is not teleological. It is the possibility to put oneself at stake in the eschaton, but the impossibility to avail of it. The unknowability of the telos and of the rhythm that guides history, as we have said, establishes the free space of human action, but also the unavoidable possibility of missing the mark, of aiming it wrong, of being led into temptation. One may miss the target because one is tempted. The idea of temptation, with all its problematic aspect, dominates right from the introduction. It is a category that is fundamental in order to account for the major peril inherent in human intentionality, that of wanting to tempt God by taking his place in the redemptive process. Hence would Rosenzweig write, temptation will be as fundamental for the passage to part 3 as miracle for part 2. Only before God, the Redeemer, does one have the unlimited liberty to decide and to tempt God, a liberty that would not be possible were it not God first to tempt man, that is, to hide himself, so that the individual may have the possibility to freely choose whether to believe and confide in him, or to replace him with himself. As emphasized above, redemption opens unto man a problematic horizon, not only with regards to what has just been said about its utopian peculiarity, but also because it is not the direct handiwork of God. It is rather, so Rosenzweig says, an indirect work of his, which takes place wherever the freedom poured forth in the act of love joins the immutable life of the world in a relationship. Only at this point, in this relationship, does the real possibility occur of tempting God, and it is prayer that institutes such a rapport. Without the enlightenment of prayer, love's action would be blind. It would not see the history of the world, neither a telos, nor the world itself, being action directed solely to whatever happens from time to time to be the fellow man. Prayer thus enlightens the world that otherwise love alone would not be able to see. But in doing so, in instituting the human order of the world, it risks intervening also in the world's divine order, that reality which is ever coming, wanting to refer solely to itself the future of history. Thus does it overcome the act of love, always circumscribed for what the fellow man is, and tyrannically moves towards last things in order to be able to avail of it according to its own intentionality. Roosevelt writes, "True, the man enlightened in prayer would like to adduce the kingdom of heaven forcibly before its appointed time, but the kingdom of heaven will not be cursed, it grows, and thus the magic power of the individual suppliant falls into the void, if it strays beyond the nearest." Thus, tyrannical prayer is ineffective, since it is impatient. There is a desirable time, a time of grace in which to pray. This is an expression, Roosevelt asserts, of the idea, dear also to the pagans, whereby the gods may be entreated only for what they are inclined to vouchsafe. Therefore, not only does it miss its appointment with that time, arriving too early, but also with a fellow being. The act of love that knows neither telos nor history becomes, in the tyrant's prayer, an act aimed at an attainable utopia, whereas the desirable time is one in which our will accords perfectly with the objective state of the things of the world. Hence, Roosevelt affirms there is no wrongful content of prayer, but only a wrong moment. The time in which redemption grows is that of the life of the world, whose rhythm and whose laws it is not given to us to know. Now, however, despite this unknowability, the possibility is conceded to man to see his prayers answered, his intentionality coincide with the reality that surrounds him, if such prayer takes place precisely in the acceptable time of grace. This time demands a further effort on the part of man, a realistic wisdom that projects the utopian desire to act in the futurity, defined by the ever possible, a wisdom that is able to discern the achievable objectives. In this sense, the utopia that defines our intentionality must never be utopic in the sense of utopos, devoid of place. The unreal on which the experience of the future is based must always be able to find support in the real of history, in the natural time of the world. Redemption is precisely the most attainable utopia. But if man lacks such discernment, the wisdom to understand the man-God relationship as one between a time-bound being and one transcending time, his prayer cannot but be tyrannical. The fanatic, the sectarian, the mystic, all of heaven's tyrants end up perching the act of love, thus delaying the coming of the kingdom which they wanted to accelerate impatiently. Apart from the visionary, Roosevelt also identified another equally sterile attitude to the future, that of the sinner, that is of the man who does not trust God's redemption and wastes the time of grace which he needs in praying for something, one's own being, which he already possesses right from the creation. His is an egoistic prayer. He prays for his own self, so that the fellow man eternally remains a he, an object amongst the men in the world of creation. Thus, by breaking the bond with the world and the fellow man, the sinner denies the work of redemption which, by contrast, consists in orienting oneself toward a he as if he were one other I. Hence arose by definition. For what is redemption other than that the I learns to say do to the he? Thus the sinner, who remains within the limits of his own self, anchored to what he already possesses, that is, to his past, misses the encounter with a fellow man, thereby delaying again the coming of the kingdom. On the other hand, effective prayer is one that keeps abreast of love, raised at the opportune time. But, asked Rosesby, how and when is this prayer raised? At this point, Rosesby surprisingly introduces the figure of Goethe, the man of life, the pure son of this earth, as he describes the poet, the fulfillment of paganism, the incarnation of earthly, natural, and pagan wisdom. In the climatic moment of his analysis of prayer, Rosesby introduces the figure of Goethe as the one who, in his very unbelief, has managed to fully make his intentionality coincide with the immutable life of the world. Effective prayer is the one recited by Goethe, labor of my hands that I finish grant all for tonight. It is the prayer of a solitary individual, addressing neither the future of the kingdom nor his own self, but his personal destiny. Here, the notion of destiny is a decisive one. It designates the fulfillment in the overall course of life of the true and proper essence of man. This is what makes man one and indivisible in his singularity, a microcosm which, at the same time, unites him with the world, roots him, and makes him grow in it. Man is in the world insofar as he has a destiny. This intimate bond that ties the part to the whole human life, to the entire life of the world, is precisely what destiny is. And it is this intimate bond, corresponding to a segment, to an hour, so Rosesby says, which has to be implored in prayer. And, writes Rosesby, that being so, this prayer is always fulfilled. Even as it is prayed, it insinuates itself into the face of the world. It never misses its mark, is never too late, nor too early. It occurs in the personal hour. Accordingly, it is ever in the desirable time. To Rosesby, all of this signifies nothing but entry upon what has already existed in the world, in creation, and thereby coming to redemption, since the latter consists in the union of the object of revelation, man, with that of creation, world, which is to say, in the coming together of a plan and a history. What has been said through a new light on the reality of paganism, as a reality that opens up the possibility of man's reconciliation with the world's time, the reconciliation that, as we have seen, is the very object of redemption. Rosesby writes, Goethe is really at the same time the great pagan and the great Christian. If Goethe's claim to be a great pagan may easily be understood, he represents the unbelief of the creaturely being, the same regarding his Christianity is less comprehensible. Goethe describes himself as the only remaining Christian. If what is meant by Christian is someone who longs to live like Christ, binding himself to the destiny of the world, Goethe is one who, with his concrete life, has brought to fulfillment the spirit of Christianity, it being the exaltation and sanctification of creation. One cannot but read here a valid criticism of that idea, proper to mysticism but also to Protestantism, according to which redemption is accessible only through faith. At this juncture, in order to account for Goethe's uniqueness, Rosesby develops the history of Christianity as one of paganism. It is a decisive passage in the introduction, the imitation of Christ, which is what the philosopher calls the historical process. It throws light on Rosenzweig's conception of the secularization of Christianity, its becoming civilized in the dominant European culture that was to play a great role in the last part of the Star. Taking a leaf out of Schelling's The Philosophy of Revelation, Rosenzweig subdivides the history of Christianity into three fundamental stages, each corresponding to an apostle and a theological virtue, each reflecting a certain relation of the Church with the life of the world. The Patrine Church, risen out of the ruins of the Roman Empire, was the one that turned to the whole world as a missionary, transcending the confines of the nation. It built churches throughout the world and organized itself as a visible body. The individual, and with him the Church itself, finds himself immediately inserted by way of love in the life of the world. Therefore, with the Patrine Church, the condition for the possibility of Christian life seemed to have been already satisfied, except that what was tied to the destiny of the world was only the fate of his act, not, however, the fate of his thought. Therefore, although the Patrine Church was able to convert the external pagan, the visible one, it could know nothing about the internal paganism, which was remembered and survived in a Christianized world. The power of love, which always acts towards a corporeal exterior could not fight such a paganism. A different instrument was needed in order to divert the eyes from the world, which acted within the soul itself and upon the soul, freeing it of its paganism. Faith was this instrument that acted with power in the Pauline centuries, which, in Rosenzweig's reconstruction, correspond to the centuries of the Protestant Reform. It certainly converted the soul, but dearly paid for such an internalization of the faith, with the loss of the unity of the visible body. Therefore, the Pauline Church, having become the invisible church of a religion reduced exclusively to the ambit of interiority and subjectivity, soon showed its weakness. If the Patrine Church had been too bound up with the body, the Pauline Church was too focused on the soul, on the spirituality of faith, to the extent that, at the final of the Pauline centuries, it was from such a weakness that German idealism, with its idea of the self-producing spirit, unmindful of the body, drew its energies. Faith, in regaining the soul, had lost the body and the world. Protestant theology and idealist philosophy marked the triumph of subjectivity, but conversely, they made the world secularized, a world even more worldly. However, Rosenzweig says, man is a microcosm. He is indivisible because he is life. His essence lies neither in the body nor in the soul, but, as we have already seen, becomes so fully in itself in the world through his destiny, which is at once body and soul. Since this destiny may be prayed for, this is where such dualism is transcended, a new time is inaugurated, that of the consummation of Christianity. Thus would the prayer, that of a non-religious but creaturely faith, be the prayer of all Christian people who, like Goethe in his singularity, would be able to access the destiny of the world and grow with it. Growth and fulfillment ought to be able to coincide in life. Thus, the new future church will not be one of the exterior or interior pagan, but that of the living pagan who sacrificed his own life in the trusting expectation of fulfillment. Hope will be the greatest virtue, which comprises in itself love and faith, and leads it back neither to the external nor to the internal, but, on an axis of temporality towards the future. As in the Ritilianum dialogue, from their separation, body and soul joined together in the cry of hope. Oh, if only you rent the heavens apart and came down. This is the age of the living pagan, of Johannine completion, which, being the fulfillment of the preceding figure, does not take on any specific form and does not become visible as a third church. And since such a church is not built, it can only grow. Underlying here is a veiled critique of Rosenstock's vision of Christianity as a church triumphans. The kingdom of heavens cannot and must not be identified with the reign of the church, nor with any other visible institution. Instead, it is an invisible community that is to bring to fulfillment the time, the community of a religion of humanity. It is at this point that Rosenzweig introduces the Jewish people as the constituent element of the new Christian age. However, it is not an emancipated Judaism that enters political reality as a visible character, participating in the history of people or nations, but the Judaism of the Holy Covenant, which becomes, beside and within Christianity itself, the element of the Johannine civilization. Rosenzweig writes, accordingly, in this incipient fulfillment of the ages, it is rather the Jew accepted into the Christian world who must convert the pagan within the Christian, for hope lives as a matter of blood inheritance only in Jewish blood. The father of this Johannine church is none other than Goethe, who, in his prayer to destiny, has created a time that is alive, vivified, a current in which could grow the creaturely life of the man, become at once body and soul, and now, inserted in the life of the world, become, that is, so mature as to welcome into his life nothing but eternity. But his prayer, which must certainly be given credit for having brought temporality back to life, is not a prayer for the advent of the kingdom. Rather, it interrupts its growth. It's an unavoidable precondition, as it leads man back to the singularity of the creaturely life, but not a sufficient condition, since such pure temporality needs to access eternity. More appropriately, to life's pure temporality, an accelerative power must be added that can anticipate the future in today, may transform eternity into an infinite now. Such prayer which accelerates the coming of the kingdom is the one pronounced by the believer, completion and not abolition of the unbeliever's prayer. Such prayer demands much more than the fulfillment of destiny. It desires eternity here and now. Since for Rosenzweig only the cyclic recurrence of the identical may be the metaphor of eternity, he sees in the hour the paradigm of a projection of that which is immutable in perceived time. Certainly, not the hour as a temporal, transient, fluid projection, but hour as an abiding movement, as nunc stans, which in its mobility reproduces a circular movement of instants that are ever beginning anew, like a circle returning in upon itself, with a beginning and an end, where the end immediately becomes the beginning. If, for Rosenzweig, this is how the projection of the eternal in time is described, it is due to the fact that the hour is not a divine creation, but an entirely human institution. This is perhaps one of the key passages to understand the heart of the problem of redemption. Man transforms into hour the natural rhythm of the times of the sun and the moon, in order to be able to perceive their repetitions, to be able to integrate them in his experience and redeem himself from the transient. Thus do year, month, day become hour in human life. Through such an absolutely human institution, man gives time an immutability that becomes the projection of eternity. particular, a purely human time, cadenced by the alternation of work and rest, is as such a true hour. It represents the point in which human and sacred time converge by intertwining. This is even more evident on the day of rest, which is the day consecrated not only to the contemplation of the work done by man in the preceding 6 days, but also to the blessing of God's work, that is, of creation. The week articulates and regulates the cultural service of the earth, but in its infinite repetition, it is also the earthly representation of the eternal. This passage takes place through the fundamental mediation of the liturgical rite. Natural time transformed into cultural repetition of the earth in a human social time is, in turn, transformed in liturgical repetition into time suited to the reception of eternity. Thus, Rosenzweig writes, the week is the germ cell of ritual, temporal abodes into which the eternal is invited. In other words, sacred time stands on, donates itself, and is understood on the basis of profane time. Returning to prayer, what does it really comprise, and where does the power of this prayer lies that makes it capable of extending such an appealing invitation to the eternal as to be indeclinable? Precisely in liturgical time, that is, in the time that belongs to everyone. The believer's prayer is the prayer of the entire community that believes, and what is highlighted to all its members is not a personal destiny, but the shared reality, the end of all things, that which is the farthest, the kingdom. Since the self-same reality to come is highlighted in the experience of an entire community, the individual may now really raise himself above his own horizon of finiteness. The believer's prayer is the consummation of the unbeliever's prayer. It is indeed necessary for life to come alive with the unbelieving prayer in order to be able to receive the gift of the eternal in the time. Therefore, Goethe's "May I fulfill the work of my hand" can no longer suffice, but may do fulfill the work of our hands. Thus does one see why the prayer to the kingdom makes up the threshold point between the manifest cosmos and the hypercosmos. It mediates between revelation and redemption, and its concrete form in the religious community, the liturgy, with its power to anticipate, cannot but be the organon of this part 3 of the star. The figure with the two superimposed triangles may now shine as a star and become fully visible. This bright figure shall not be revealed by the way of language, as in part 2, but it will do without words in order to become pure liturgical gesture, the gesture of arms raised to the heavens, which is eloquent without the lips having to move. In the liturgical gesture, the pagan's prayer fuses with that of the believer. The intention, turned to one's own action in history, now becomes one and the same with the intention turned to the eternity of the kingdom. Here lies the heart of Rosenzweig's vision of history and of the problem that animates part 3 of the star, that of the relation between human action and last things, eschata. For Rosenzweig, the history of salvation takes place amongst 3 intentions oriented to the kingdom. If it were not so, human action would only be able either to remain ineffective, bringing about acceleration, delay in the advent of the kingdom, or, on the contrary, be effective, but cause an arrest in its growth in history. Man himself becomes the request, the cry addressed to the eternal kingdom, because what is at stake is the relation between love and the world, human action and the last things, the finite possession of time and eternal reality. Redemption is thus possible only in the yearning that it be fulfilled, recognizing its ever being beyond anything containable within knowledge and experience. Man may only act oriented by the desire to become one with God and the world, according to a modality that he can never embrace in its totality. All of part 3 of the star may thus be understood only in the light of that motto, in tyrannos, against all tyranny, all presumption to embrace all of history, all totalitarianism of heavens, and perhaps, should we interpret it as a sort of collective tyranny against all political sciences that would build society without any relation with the absolute. Unbelief and faith become one. God's truth want to be entreated by both hands, writes Rosenzweig, with the hands of the believer and the unbeliever. Truth demands that incessant and eternal quest for realization, that is the pagan's one, join the quest oriented by the hope of the kingdom towards a common goal. The entreaty must fuse with the historical experience of a calling to intentionality, it being an anticipation of the eternal. The unbeliever hand has to rise together with that of the believer, Rosenzweig concludes, with the hand we might add of Judaism and Christianity, as will be seen in the following book of the star. Thank you.